Welcome everyone to the Virtual Member Forum. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Lead for ArchivesSpace, and I am delighted to be here to welcome you to the 2024 Virtual Member Forum. We have a very full schedule and I don't want to take up too much time, but before we dive into the forum, I want to very briefly take care of a few housekeeping items. The forum wiki will be dropped into the chat. That has the agenda and other helpful information. You may want to refer to that throughout the entire Virtual Member Forum. We also have several members of the forum planning team on hand, and they can help if you have any questions about the forum. You can leave and come back during sessions as you wish. Your connection information will remain the same. However, if you plan to attend any other sessions of the forum, you will need to have registered for that separately. You can still register for those now, and you will receive separate connection information for that. We are recording today's sessions, and recordings will be linked in the event wiki page in the coming days. We are using Zoom webinar today, and your microphone and camera are both muted. If you'd like to ask questions of a presenter, we ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will hold all questions for each presenter until the end of their presentation. At that time, I'll read your question out loud to the presenter for them to address. Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A in an effort to keep the forum on schedule, so keep an eye on that for additional information and resources. If you have a general question, need some other form of assistance, or just want to chat with your fellow attendees, please feel free to reach out using the chat option at the bottom of your screen instead of the Q&A. Again, any questions that you'd like the presenter to address, please do put those in the Q&A. Otherwise, they may not get answered. Keep in mind there are many participants and attendees in this forum coming from a variety of institutions and experience levels. The ArchivesSpace Code of Conduct applies to all ArchivesSpace events, including virtual events. Please remember to be considerate and respectful in your interactions with your fellow attendees, presenters, forum planning team, and to the program team staff in the Q&A and chat. If you need to alert the program team to an issue, you can use the chat to privately alert Christine DeBella or myself, or you can email archivespacehome@lyrasis.org. Keep in mind, due to the large number of attendees and the fact that we are currently participating in the forum, we may not be able to resolve all issues or get to your email, but we'll do our best. And now, on to some thank yous. First, thank you to our forum planning team. ArchivesSpace is a community-supported program, and we require the input, effort, and expertise of our members in all things, including in planning wonderful events like this. I'm very grateful to this year's forum planning team for soliciting presentations and developing this wonderful agenda. And you'll see some of the members of the team popping up in the chat, like I said, over the next 2 days. It speaks to the depth of expertise in our community that we have such a variety of presentations to learn from this week, but it takes time, effort, and patience to pull something like this together. So a big thank you to Alex McGee, Bailey Grace Harrell, Christine Leapson, Jackie Johnson, skipping myself, Katerina Demetria Schuster, Regina Haberline, and Sarit Ham. Thank you all so much. This has been a really fun process. And also, thank you to all of the presenters and discussion leaders we will hear from over the next 2 days. Each presenter will be introduced in their session, but I wanted to acknowledge them here as well. We couldn't have forums like this without engaged users willing to share their knowledge and expertise with the rest of the community. I have said this at every forum for the past few years, and unfortunately, it continues to only be more true. But I know that we all have a lot on our plates right now, and I'm deeply appreciative for each presenter dedicating the time and energy to participate in this forum. So a sincere thank you to everyone on this list. And finally, thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to 2 great days of presentations, discussions, and learning. Please feel free to chime in during Q&As, connect with one another in the chat, or just enjoy time learning from others working in ArchivesSpace. And with that, we're actually going to get started. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Bree, if you want to go ahead and start sharing yours while I read your introduction. First up, we have McLaughlin of Indiana University presenting Training and Managing Multiple ArchivesSpace Repositories at a Very Large Institution. Indiana University's ArchivesSpace instance hosts 31 repositories across 7 campuses. Each campus has its own needs, and each repository's needs are even more specific. Contemplating how to introduce a new application to dozens of collections managers while training oneself is overwhelming. In this session, Bree will present a use case of how to address the specialized needs of multiple institutions while providing broad instruction. This presentation will be useful for any ArchivesSpace member institution getting started creating local workflows, but especially for very large institutions. In addition to practical training and recommendation, Bree will also express the importance and benefits of cultivating and maintaining relationships with collections managers and share experience with managing the impossibly large amount of metadata shared by all repositories. With that, I'll turn things over to Bree.
Okay, and are we seeing my presentation right now?
We're seeing your presentations and we can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. All right, my name is Bree McLaughlin. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian at Indiana University. Today, I'm going to be sharing what I've learned from training and managing multiple ArchivesSpace repositories at a very large institution. I've utilized passive and active training methods, and my goal has been to create enough training materials that collection managers can feel self-sufficient. I'm available to help, but that's not always sustainable for so many repositories. This model has gone pretty well for us, so hopefully it will be helpful to you, especially if you're just getting started in ArchivesSpace. Obviously, the ArchivesSpace Help Center is an invaluable resource for myself and all users at IU. The training materials that I'll describe today are supplemental and provide specific recommendations based on our use cases. I will be talking about a lot of documents and training materials throughout this presentation, and I've linked them all at the end. They're all publicly available, and I am happy to share. Indiana University is made up of 7 campuses across Indiana. Our ArchivesSpace instance is home to 31 repositories across those campuses. I started this job in February 2020, and my main priority was to prepare for and manage the migration of all of our finding aids from a legacy system into ArchivesSpace by summer 2020. I won't speak to the actual migration part in this presentation because a lot of it was planned before my time at IU, and at that point, our very talented graduate student employees were the ones making that migration possible. I'm going to progress through this presentation more or less chronologically to show when and how I started managing and training multiple repositories in ArchivesSpace. Weeks after I started this job, I suddenly found myself working from home with a lot of time to myself. I used this time to hunker down and begin learning ArchivesSpace with the goal of having basic documentation to share before finding aids migrated in the summer. And you'll see on this timeline that I was able to share the basic documentation in March 2020 that I adapted from existing documentation from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, IUPUI. This seems crazy to me 4 years later, and my best guess is that I was on the hyperfixation peak of the lockdown roller coaster. I do not recommend this pace in this timeline in general. But with that said, I was also learning ArchivesSpace at the same time, and writing documentation was like writing notes to me. This is what most of our basic ArchivesSpace documentation looked like. We went pretty much field by field, defining and making recommendations for each. The helpful hints that pop up when you mouse over fields in ArchivesSpace are helpful, but some of our collection managers requested having similar information in a document that they could print out and refer to when they aren't actively using ArchivesSpace. And by summer 2020, collection managers had the tools necessary to create basic collection level finding aids. I also adapted the glossary from the ArchivesSpace Help Center to specifically address questions that had arisen from conversations with collection managers just getting started. For example, the concept of a top container versus an instance was hard for us to wrap our heads around. I created the image on the right in the documentation to hopefully clear that up. I still update this glossary in direct response to the questions that warranted the term being added to the glossary. I also started bi-weekly office hours in spring 2020 to get folks acquainted with ArchivesSpace before all of their finding aids migrated. I still hold those office hours today. They're usually actually happening right now, but I only do them once a week now. Attendance definitely ebbs and flows, but collection managers like knowing that there is a set time that they can come to ask me questions or send their student employees for an introduction to ArchivesSpace. I listened to the concerns being raised during my office hours and other meetings and created training materials accordingly. Once collection managers felt more or less comfortable using ArchivesSpace to view existing finding aids and create basic collection level finding aids, the next priority was to provide instructions for adding inventories to new finding aids. The next training materials I created / adapted were for the spreadsheet importer back when it was just a plugin. I can't remember when that became part of the core code, but we were using version 2.7.1 until last year, so that definitely didn't apply to us yet. One of our graduate student employees began adapting Harvard's documentation, and she expanded on the common issues section at the end of that documentation, which I think is the most read part of this documentation. She provided screenshots of error messages to fix she provided screenshots of error messages and how to fix data to avoid those errors. Fortunately for her and unfortunately for me, she graduated, so I finished the document along with the help of volunteer collection managers. I added sections like you can see on the left to illustrate concepts like ingest hierarchy that are hard to explain without a visual. Along with the documentation, I adapted our spreadsheet template to fit our needs. We had and still have a massive metadata problem, especially right after migrating. And I try to nip that in the bud at any opportunity I have. One major help was adding additional validation to fields in the spreadsheet template. The main culprit for our metadata problem was extent type. After migration, I think we had well over 2,000 extent types. We have since cut and merged over 1,000 of those. And that is a story I'd be happy to complain about another time. During monthly meetings with collection managers, we came up with a controlled list of extent types to add to a validator on the template. It's a long list, but still only a fraction of what we were dealing with. And remember that we have 31 repositories whose collections span many mediums that require different extent types. This list isn't set in stone, and folks still add me to add values every now and then. It's not a perfect system, but it has massively reduced the duplicate, near duplicate, or inaccurate extent types. Folks were still getting intimidated by the spreadsheet importer, so I made some supplemental training videos. In one video, I go through the fields of the spreadsheet template, and in the other, I demonstrate sample imports. A few months later, volunteer collection managers and I created documentation for rapid data entry. This was the first piece of documentation that we created completely from scratch. Much of my recommendations were the same as the spreadsheet importer, but with different mechanics. I also included information about creating templates, including naming conventions, since the templates are shared between repositories, and that could get very messy very fast. If I could choose only a handful of overall recommendations for folks getting started in ArchivesSpace, it would almost always be naming conventions. By the time I was writing this documentation, it became clear from collection manager feedback that they wanted all the examples, especially from other repositories. One thing I haven't considered is that since most of our repositories are at least in different buildings, let alone different cities, they don't know how others are using ArchivesSpace in the user interface. I thought it would be a good idea to get samples from a few collection managers at different repositories to add to an appendix, like you can see on this slide. Speaking of examples, I created 2 demo videos for rapid data entry as well. The first video had common examples of common entries in rapid data entry. And the second is an overview of time-saving tips using features like fill column and sticky columns. And we can make these videos available through a service that we have on campus, Media Collections Online, which is publicly available. And as I mentioned before, we were using version 2.7.1 until last year. And for anybody who has used ArchivesSpace for a few years or more, you'll know that rapid data entry has been massively improved since then. With that said, I spent a lot of the time in these videos saying, okay, this is an example of a bug in rapid data entry, and this is how you work around it. And it's those details that are specific to our instance of ArchivesSpace and the version that we're using. jump scare for a giant decision tree. There was about a 6-month gap before the next piece of documentation. I think the beginning of 2021 is around when our quote unquote temporary COVID projects came to an end and collection managers were coming back to campus to handle existing collections in person. I fielded a lot of questions about editing existing finding aids in ArchivesSpace. Without getting into it too much, there isn't an easy answer to how do I edit finding aids. This monstrosity on the screen is the decision tree that simplifies the answer, which is essentially it depends. Volunteer collection managers and I set out to create the managing component list documentation from scratch to elaborate on this decision tree. Just like the decision tree, this documentation is organized by how the component list was originally created. I learned that it was important that was an important question in regards to having a backup inventory. For example, say a collection manager imported a spreadsheet of an inventory. They want to keep that inventory as a spreadsheet as a non-encoded backup. If they decide to use rapid data entry to add components, there isn't necessarily a way to export those components to a spreadsheet as a new backup. For that reason, it would be easier for that collection manager to continue using the spreadsheet importer rather than switching up their data entry method. We have a few collection managers who are dedicated to EAD, and to that I say power to them. But we also had some long-term archivists who could more easily make the connection between EAD and ArchivesSpace than what we had in the basic documentation. With that in mind, I adapted the EAD import and export map from the ArchivesSpace technical documentation to make an EAD appendix. The main difference is that I added examples from IU finding aids and arranged the categories to match our documentation. And on the right is a handy dandy note type appendix that I created beforehand to map note types from EAD to ArchivesSpace to ArcLight, which is our public user interface integration. As I mentioned before, we had and still have a metadata problem post-migration. Last I checked, we had around 40,000 subjects and agents in ArchivesSpace. With so many repositories and collection managers, duplicates, near duplicates, and errors are inevitable. Volunteer collection managers and I created this decision tree to help folks decide if they really needed to add a new agent or subject. The answer is usually no, the record already exists. I could get into that more, but that is yet another story I'd be happy to complain about another time. By 2022, IU collection managers pretty much had ArchivesSpace down for creating and managing finding aids. I started to hear some folks complaining about an archaic accession software, AskSam, and thus created the accession creation working group. Myself and volunteer collection managers created documentation for the bare minimum accession record in ArchivesSpace. We approached this in the opposite way of all of our previous documentation because there was really no benefit to repositories using the same model for accession records since they're all internal. So this documentation had the instructions for a basic accession record and for using accession or ArchivesSpace modules like events or functions like spawning resources to optimize accession creation. Okay, that was a lot. That was a lot of information. And I want to emphasize again that my documentation creation was fast-tracked by a variety of external factors, the primary of which being a global pandemic. But I was also new to a job where I didn't have many other service or research responsibilities yet. That pace was not normal, nor should a new ArchivesSpace service manager look to this timeline as aspirational. But what I want to make clear and what I'd like for folks to be able to take away from these examples is how the order of creation related to the feedback I was getting from collection managers and how I work to make each document broadly applicable to all 31 repositories. Now that I'm a couple years removed from creating all of those resources, this is my general workflow when somebody new is learning ArchivesSpace. First, I have a general introduction meeting with them. If they're a new collection manager or have a specific collection in mind, we talk a little bit about their goals and what type of finding aid they're hoping to create. If it's a student or staff working under a collection manager, I try to share what I know about how their repository typically creates finding aids. Then I give them access to ArchivesSpace and give them links to all of the resources that I've talked about so far. I give them access to their home repository, but I also give them access to an unpublished training repository. This way they can practice without worrying about messing up on a finding aid that is publicly available. I strongly encourage them to use the training repository. In that first meeting, I share my screen and walk through the modules they'll be using in ArchivesSpace. The first meeting is inevitably overwhelming because it's an information dump from all of the resources that I'm sharing, but they usually leave feeling more confident about ArchivesSpace in general. And lastly, I expect periodic follow-up emails and office hour visits, and we just kind of feel it out from there. In a large institution with so many repositories, I think it's even more important to build trust with collection managers. Amidst all this documentation, I was chairing a committee called the Archives Online Working Group, named after Archives Online, which you can see on the right. That is our finding aid discovery website. This working group was made up of all collection managers across Indiana University campuses. I used this group to share updates about Archives Online, and we could also troubleshoot issues and plan customizations and improvements to our user interface. The working group is a great way to share updates and field questions. Collection managers had at least a monthly opportunity to be face-to-face with me amongst other collection managers with similar questions. The communication throughout these meetings was crucial for such a large institution. Most do not use ArchivesSpace the same way, so finding common denominators was very helpful for me. Communication and relationship building with collection managers was imperative to making this work. Indiana University is a huge school. I work at the flagship location in Bloomington, and I quickly started picking up on some tension about non-Bloomington IU campuses feeling secondary in many ways because of the existing structure of communication. Having to work virtually due to COVID was actually an unforeseen equalizer in that respect. And I'm sure you've all attended a hybrid meeting where it kind of feels like you're a fly on the wall watching the meeting happen. Before COVID, the Archives Online Working Group meetings were hybrid, and since most collection managers are in Bloomington, the in-person part was in Bloomington and the regional campuses attended via Zoom. This problem definitely isn't exclusive to IU, and I get the feeling that this is how it worked with most large universities with regional campuses. Still, broad participation increased steadily once we were all on Zoom, which meant I was able to more effectively write documentation that would be useful for everybody. And I will continue to advocate for Zoom-only meetings for this working group for that reason. So that was my path to training and managing many repositories at a very large institution. I am still training folks periodically, whether they're student employees or new collection managers. I am also still keeping up with updating documentation as our circumstances change. For example, we upgraded to version 3.3.1 last year, finally, and each document that I've created needs a significant overhaul. The basic documentation is up to date, but I'm still working on the rest. And these are links to all of the documents that I've mentioned so far, or all the documents that I've created. The first link, the ArchivesSpace documentation and demo videos, is a umbrella wiki page that has links to everything as well. Great. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this session or via email. My contact information and links to all of the materials I mentioned are included here. And thank you very much for letting me be the first presenter today.
Thank you. Thank you for being the first presenter. That's always nerve-wracking. Um, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for including those links in your presentation. Presentation slides will be made available with the recording. So I know many of you are already asking questions in the chat about that. So we're going to go ahead and move to the Q&A portion. We are going to do Q&A for 5 minutes. So let's do this. Let's do this, Bree. All right. So the first question we have is about your videos. How often do you have to update videos? How often do you need to add new ones? Do you already have a problem of needing to put a significant time into video creation and editing? How do you decide if it's too much work?
How do I decide if it's too much work? That's funny.
Yeah.
Clearly, I have an issue with that. But I haven't edited any of the videos yet, and that is one of those resources are what I am very anxious to update since we have upgraded our version of ArchivesSpace. My intention is to update our resources as we upgrade versions of ArchivesSpace. If there isn't a significant change in how we use ArchivesSpace based on a version upgrade, then it may not be necessary, but I'm trying to keep up to date with our upgrades.
Thanks. Rebecca says she likes the idea of office hours where archivists can ask questions. Can you say more about how those work and are they online?
Yeah, they're all virtual. And I started doing them bi-weekly and now I just do them once a week. And I have a 2-hour time where I am on Zoom, a specific Zoom room that everyone has the link to. And I am just there in case anybody needs help. If they have questions, they don't have to tell me ahead of time if they're dropping by. And it's pretty flexible. Like I'll go months without anybody stopping by, and then suddenly it's week to week to week. Somebody is always there, but I keep notes for all of the office hours that are publicly available, so folks can, kind of see what other people are having questions about as well, and hopefully that kind of clears things up for multiple people.
That's interesting. You get to see when priorities are shifting according to who comes to the meetings. It's kind of fun. So Trip, I'm going to skip your second question, but we'll come back to it. Kevin asks, how did you decide when to write local documentation and when to rely on the ArchivesSpace documentation?
So I think it was when the number of questions that I had that were specific to our ArchivesSpace instance started to outweigh the questions that I could send them to the ArchivesSpace documentation for. And I also started to become, I mean, frankly, I started to become overwhelmed with all of the questions. So it's like, okay, I just need to make documentation that answers these questions, even if I'm repeating some information that's already available elsewhere.
Good point. It's an interesting turning point. And Kelly says, how do you approach management of container profiles across all of the repositories?
We don't use container profiles, and I've tried to gauge interest in container profiles several times, and our collection managers haven't seemed very interested in them. And I think it may also just be having a very large institution with a few repositories that are very large and have their own kind of space management systems in check already. So that's not really something that we have made use of.
Thanks. All right. Last question. And so Trip asked, could you talk more about documentation maintenance and upgrades? Trip has just gone through one. I can tell. Talk about your maintenance schedule. And then there was another question that came to me directly about how the format that you provide this documentation. Is it PDF or Word documents? How do you maintain the documentation?
Yeah, so to address the first question, I kind of talked about, updating documentation along with our upgrades. And we do that with, the working group is called the Finding Aid Creation in ArchivesSpace Working Group. And we basically just comb through each document when we upgrade or have any changes in our use of ArchivesSpace. And we kind of just go section by section until we can check it off and share it again widely. And the second question, I forget what that is. What was the second question again?
So another question came to me about how the format that you make the documentation available in.
Right. We share them in PDFs, and as we've been updating our documentation, I've been doing my best to make them more accessible as well, adding alt text for all of the images as well. I've considered making them just on wikis or something like that, and I don't know if there's really any rhyme or reason why I chose PDF to begin with. But that's just kind of what we've stuck to at this point, other than some of the resources that are on the wiki, like the glossary or any of the appendices.
Awesome, thanks. That is a huge amount of work to maintain that documentation, Bree. So maybe a follow-up presentation next year where you talk about the ongoing maintenance of this. I know people would be interested. But thank you so much for sharing, and what a great way to kick off the forum. We are going to go ahead and move to our next presentation of the day. But if anyone has any more questions, if Bree's sticking around, maybe we can keep having conversation in the chat. But we're going to go ahead and move on to our next session. So Cory or Susannah, whoever is sharing their slides, if you want to go ahead and start. So our next presentation, we have Cory Nimer from Brigham Young University and Susannah Broyles from Texas State University presenting Found in Translation, an update on the Multilingual Description Task Force from the Usability Subteam. This session will review the results of a community survey on multilingual description and the development of use cases based on these results. This initial work, undertaken by the Usability Subteam with the assistance of an advisory group of community volunteers, seeks to identify and document staff and public user needs. The resulting use cases will serve as the basis for a specification for future development work. This session will present the survey results and use case drafting process to solicit community feedback. Cory and Susannah, over to you.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I apologize. It is allergy season in Texas, so my voice is going in and out. So my apologies. So I'm going to do the high-level overview of the results of the community survey. But first, some background. And if we can go to the next slide, Cory. Okay, so due to multiple GR tickets over the years requesting multilingual description functionality, ArchivesSpace has asked for community developed specification for multilingual description to guide development work. This was made a priority. This was made a priority by the programs team and was included for the winter 2024 development in the May 2023 roadmap. And in that, and because of that, it was part of the usability sub-team work plan of this year. So that was put on our work plan. And for the last few months of 2023, we did our due diligence, did lots of research, gathered resources to kind of get the lay of the land. And once we did that, we created a survey to gauge the community interest and potential uses for this. So we sent out the survey via the ArchivesSpace listserv and Google group, various SAA listservs, and the ICA listserv in November 2023. And we received 84 responses. Next slide. And so onto the data. Like I said, this is going to be a very overarching view of the results. And as always, if you're curious to see any of the raw data or other segments, please let us know and we can get that to y'all. And so you can see the overwhelming institution type is academic archives with 50 respondents being part of that, which is 60%. After that, special collections, museum archives on down. And each of those really brought their own interpretation to the survey. And next slide. And so also I wanted to show that while the respondents typically came from the US, there was a lot of engagement from the Netherlands, the UK, Belgium, Canada, China, and Australia. So breaking things down further, next slide, please. You can see from the US repository types, again, overarchingly from academic archives and special collections, and a few more business and corporate archives. And if we go to the international institutions, the same kind of breakdown. So this is a very heavily influenced by academic archives. And next slide. And another really interesting takeaway was the average staff size of repositories, with a lot of repositories only having 1 to 5 staff members, and the next one being more than 20, which is a very big jump. So again, you will see this in the free text responses that I'm going to show off later. Next slide. So this is really intriguing to see which record types that people would like to be able to include multilingual descriptions for. Again, most of them were resource records, then repository, and then digital objects and subjects, about the same. And that just really shows where people really are seeking this. Next slide. And this is just how important is multilingual description for your institution. And you can see that there was a lot of interest and a lot of importance in this. Next slide. Okay, so like I was saying earlier, the free text answers, I just picked a few to really highlight the main topics that came up. And as you can see in the first one, there's a lot of institutions that collect things in multiple languages. And the overarching theme in this was making these materials more available to those who primarily only speak those languages, and really trying to link the material to the people. And again, the next quote, that said it much more articulately than I just did. It would allow us to better connect certain collections to communities whose those collection descriptions matter most. And the last one brings in some more technical aspects that Cory is going to really show how we try to integrate into the use cases. And next slide. Some of the challenges are not unique in this. A lot of it goes to staffing and just not having the staffing available to create multilingual description. And really, that just was a major focus with a major theme in the challenges, is just not having the staff to do this. So a lot of people were very intrigued about having ArchivesSpace being the leader of this. And next slide. And that kind of goes into this. How likely is your institution to use multilingual description if it was added? I mean, I feel like that really says a lot, that people are really seeking this. And this goes over to the use cases. So Cory, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Susannah. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about the use cases and the work that came out of that survey from last year. After we finished gathering that data, as part of the survey process, we allowed individuals to indicate whether they'd be interested in serving on a task force to build a set of use cases based on the data. And we were lucky to have a great group. I'm not going to list all the names here, but I'll just say that it included representatives from academic and government archives from both the United States and Europe, as well as members of the usability subteam. Our first step in that process then was to review the community feedback from the survey, and then to go through and identify what the individual use cases would be. And for those that might not be familiar with use cases, our goal with writing this documentation was just to sort of write down what it was, what the desired functionality was, and usability that people were looking for, so that we could build a specification on top of that. The documented use cases that we were putting together aimed at describing how users would interact with the system, including the steps that they would take to complete tasks. And then we also tried to include alternative workflows, just to document if there was a preferred workflow, what were our other options in implementing that functionality. Generally, use cases don't include details about display or mock-ups of what that would look like necessarily. They're mostly meant just to guide discussion within the community about what it is that we're looking for. So after reviewing the comments, we started to draft these use cases based on modules first. So looking at the resource records or other pieces of ArchivesSpace to see how that would fit in before moving on to cross-module functionalities like exports. And so for each of these areas, we identified the users that would be needing this functionality, looking at existing conditions that were necessary to perform the tasks, and then documenting the preferred or alternative workflows for each of those use cases. Again, normally we wouldn't have done mock-ups, but for the sake of our discussion today, I have created some mock-ups of what this description might look like that we'll come to in just a second. So in terms of the use cases, we ended up with 13 different use cases, including all of the modules available in the public user interface, except for accessions. And Susannah showed that slide about user interest in the different modules. Accessions was listed as having only 16% of institutions using the PUI to display that information. And so we ended up leaving it out of our use case list for right now. Other functional areas you can see here included record import and export and API access to records within the system. So let's look at what these use cases format looked like. For each of the use cases, we used a simplified format, again, including impacted users, preconditions necessary for the functionality, and some preferred and alternative workflows. So this is use case number 1 for the public user interface, and it focused on how external users would access multilingual content recorded in the application. So in the preferred workflow, according to, again, our community feedback and the input of our task force, users would be able to select their preferred language from a context-specific dropdown from anywhere in the site. The workflow also establishes the need for selecting a default language for a repository, and it also provides an option for parallel display of multilingual content for comparison's sake, as in some cases, the content might vary slightly between different languages. We also included an alternative workflow or two with some, again, other options that had been presented in our discussions, which we're hoping to get additional feedback from the community on. In terms of what this might look like, again, in this mock-up of what this might look like in the PUI, at a basic level, you'd see that language selection drop down at the top right, as well as the C translation note expansion link after the scope and content, sort of toward the bottom of this screenshot. And then using the drop-down to select another language, and again, assuming that that alternative entry was available in that language, it would then display the content in the selected language. Looking quickly at a couple more use cases. Use case 2 focused on staff data entry and editing for the resource records. And so here the preferred workflow called for the inclusion of language and script drop-down boxes for each field, as well as the possibility of recording this information in the RDE view. In practice, this would mean entering notes and other entries in different languages in parallel in the application. For example, you might record a scope and content note in English and then a separate scope and content note in Spanish within the same record. Looking at a mock-up of that again, this again would mean adding a language and script drop-down for each note, note type, as well as other fields, and making those repeatable. One of those that came up right away was the title field, which right now is not repeatable. And so being able to record it in a multilingual parallel fashion didn't really fit with the current model. And so in use case 4, we included information about making that repeatable. But in our discussion, we've also talked about the need for having transcribed titles perhaps not be replaced with a language switch in the interface, even if translated titles were available. For device titles, that would probably not be the same issue though, and might want to be switched out according to language. And so looking at the mock-up for this, we can see the primary changes would be changing this to a drop-down, or including a drop-down for title type, and providing additional fields for transcribed titles with a language and script drop-down as part of that sub-record entry. In some areas of the application, supporting parallel multiple entries required greater adjustments, as seen in use case 6. In this case, the documents also called for implementing some additional functionality from other submitted tickets that weren't specifically multilingual, such as selecting an authorized term and a display term from ANW 1145, or linking related terms from ANW 361. And so these features can be seen in the mockups here with a selector button for authorized terms and display name, or maybe it should have been display term, as well as the language and script dropdowns in the term entry. Then lower in that same subject record, a repeatable scope and scope note, not scope and content note, scope note for the subject with its language and script dropdowns, and the related information section allowing linking to broader, narrower, related or equivalent terms. So we really appreciate the work of the Multilingual Description Task Force members, as well as the community in sending in comments, leading to the creation of these use cases. But before we move forward from the use case stage to developing a specification, we do want to make sure that there aren't additional use cases or other issues that need to be considered. So for that reason, we'd like to invite the community to read through the use case documentation and submit comments. We'll review all of those comments once they're received, and we'll create a revised version of the use case document that can be used for establishing requirements and then moving on to building that full specification. Once this has been completed, all of these documents will also be circulated and updated before being added to A&W 957, which is the core ticket in JIRA related to multilingual description. We'll also send out this information by email to the community, but those links will be available here in the slides. So at this point, I think we're open to any questions that you might have at this phase, either about the process or about the details of the use cases. But if you don't have questions today, again, we'd invite everyone to submit comments as part of that online form. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Cory. Thanks, Susannah. Yeah, this was great. Very interesting. Let me look in the Q&A before I start asking my own question. Oh, Kevin says, comment, not question. The use cases look great. I look forward to seeing the spec. Yeah, definitely agree. I did have a question about next steps and timeline. If you, is there a particular date by which you want people to submit comment on the form?
So our overall goal is to have the specification in place before the end of the term, which is a very aggressive timeline.
Yeah.
In terms of comments, I'll include that in the call that goes out in the email, but the last time for the survey, we tried to give everyone a month. We'll probably aim for something along those lines. And so having the survey close toward the end of April before moving forward. Gotcha.
Awesome. Writing that down. All right, some questions in the chat. Since we did run late, we're going to take 5 minutes for to do Q&A now because we do have some questions. That will push our break back, but we'll still get the full 10-minute break. So just so you know, I know we're running over time, but we're still going to do the full break. Question from Brad. Did you address non-Latin scripts in this project, in particular those that read right to left like Arabic?
So the use case does not specifically call that out, although it was part of our discussion. I think it does make sense to make sure that that's clear in the specification and should probably be documented in the use case as well. But it was an issue in our discussions, and it is something that hopefully can be addressed.
Thanks. Yeah. Kevin asks, will the spec include metadata export maps for EAD?
So the spec should include export mappings, but I don't think that those should be finalized just on their own. I don't remember the name of the team, but the metadata
Standards sub-team.
Metadata standard subteam should definitely have a chance to review those and make sure they're lining up with their objectives before that gets finalized.
Yeah, very true. Cory asks, when asking using what parts of ArchivesSpace they want to add multilingual functionality, was there a breakdown between resources versus archival objects? Meaning, are we considering adding multilingual functionality to archival objects specifically as well? They share a lot of fields with resources.
Yes. So the documentation, I think it should include resource records, archival objects, digital object records, and digital object component records in those sections. But it does include a variety of other portions of the application, including repository records and subject records. So we tried to include it wherever it made sense. Again, there there were maybe a couple of reasons for not including it in accessions. The biggest one being that most institutions were not making that information available in the PUI according to the survey. But also just the structure of the accession records didn't lend itself to making that multilingual modification without major revisions to how that looks and works.
Thanks. All right. Before I read the next two questions, I just want to clarify that the functionality we're talking about is enabling the ability to provide multilingual description, not performing the actual translations themselves. So the next question was existing built-in translation capability of the various browsers considered as part of the use case discussions?
So in terms of the use cases, that was not part of our discussion, but I think Susannah made it clear that especially for smaller institutions, there was that was an issue that came up. It was something that people were interested in. But we didn't look at how to enable that or maybe streamline that. I believe that that's still available either through a browser plugin or running a URL through a service like Google Translate. But it wasn't an area that we looked at.
Right. Thanks. We have 1 more minute, so I'm going to ask one more question, but there are multiple questions in the Q&A. So maybe if either Cory or Susannah, if you have a second, if you could type an answer to these. But the last question I'm going to read, any thoughts for using generative AI transliteration services rather than manual data entry?
I don't have any thoughts. I don't know, Susannah, if you have any ideas there. I mean, we were looking at this as manual data entry. There are translation services that might be available.
I think that would be up to the institution itself rather than an ArchivesSpace thing.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this is specifically about enabling the functionality, not about performing the translation or how you perform the translation. So I think it's an interesting question. I think both of those questions are really interesting and maybe great questions for the listserv. And will probably questions like that will begin to be generated on the listserv when this functionality moves farther along in the process for sure. But not your questions to answer right now, Cory and Susannah, that's for sure. We are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and end. But yeah, thank you so much to Cory and Susannah both for your update on this. This has been really interesting to watch, and I've just got to say the 84 responses on the survey was awesome. This is really great work. So we're going to go ahead and move into break now, though. And if you've been following along in the chat, Confluence has been down, so you haven't been able to look at the agenda. But thank goodness it came back at the perfect moment. We're going to go ahead and move to break. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. We're going to come back at 10 minutes after the hour. You don't have to be listening to me right now. You can assume that we're already moved into break. But we're going to come back 10 minutes after the hour for our next round of sessions. Thank you, everyone. Hi, Thimios. If you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, I can do that. Let me go ahead and stop sharing mine.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, you can go ahead and start sharing yours to make sure everything's okay. We're going to get started in one more minute and I'll read your introduction, so no need to get started with anything, but if you want to go ahead and share your screen to be ready, that makes sense.
Okay, let me know if that looks good.
Yeah, I can see your presentation. It does, you're sharing your whole desktop, so I can see other things too, just so you know. Right now it's just the Zoom reminder for the virtual member forum, but just so you know, in case things pop up. Yeah. All right. Yeah, you're good to go. Yeah. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with our next presentation. Just as a reminder, for those of you that have joined, we do use Atlassian for our wiki, which includes the agenda for today's session, and Atlassian is having an internet-wide outage. So you're probably not able to see the wiki right now, and that includes the Help Center and our agenda. But we're good to go. We have our agenda here and we're going to keep on moving. But we are aware of it. There's nothing we can do about it. And yeah, we're all happy to be together. All right. So our next session or our next presentation is our still somewhat new ArchivesSpace technical lead, Thimios Dimopulos. I'm going to say it wrong, Dimopulos, and he is going to be presenting on creating actionable feature requests in ArchivesSpace. A major part of the interaction between users, developers, and testers of ArchivesSpace happens through feature requests. In this session, we will talk about what makes an actionable feature request and introduce behavior scenarios as a way to describe features. Take it away, Thimios.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. Very much related to the previous session and in the subject of requirements and requirement specification. I will talk about our Jira feature requests and some ideas about how to make them more actionable, and including introducing the concept of behavior scenarios as a way to describe new features. So what makes a feature request actionable? Generally being short and to the point is a virtue always. Being unambiguous and easy to comprehend is also something that helps. And being complete in the sense of leaving no open questions and providing detailed information. Asking ourselves why bother? Actionable feature requests are generally more easily reviewed during prioritization, so they are actually more likely to be prioritized for development. They should be also making the communication between the people involved more effective, and they should also be capturing the accumulated knowledge that we gather during discussing a feature about a specific feature for future reference. So feature requests on Jira are actually the places where three kinds of people meet and communicate on a topic. There are the users, the people who understand the everyday workflows within libraries and archives that ArchivesSpace supports. And they are in need of a specific functionality that is not yet supported, therefore submitting and talking about a feature request. There are the developers, who are the people who need to comprehend the requirement, understand the feature, and translate it to actual programming code in the ArchivesSpace system. And there is also the testers, the people who are there to verify that the requirement is fulfilled, therefore verify the acceptance criteria, as we say. We can assume that all those people involved have a good knowledge of how an ArchivesSpace system generally works. We cannot assume always a familiarity with organization-specific workflows and processes. And if a feature request also impacts or is dependent on archival standards, this is something that we should also include in the JIRA ticket, in the feature request. The feature request JIRA issue is also the place where knowledge about a supported workflow is captured. And this refers to how a specific archival workflow is to be supported by the ArchivesSpace system. It can also include implementation-specific technical details that developers or people who understand the technicality also communicate about in the JIRA ticket communication. And we can also see the history of the communication. This is also very important. By just looking at the conversation within a JIRA ticket, we can see who were the people involved, what were the opinions and different ideas expressed. And of course, hopefully, we can see the final agreed specification, which is very important for everybody involved, of course. By the way, it is something that we notice that in many of our JIRA issues, the final agreed details of the feature often are not summarized in the description of the JIRA issue. We will see an example of this further. Therefore, it happens that one has to go through the whole conversation to develop a mental model of the feature that can be quite ambiguous. So capturing the communication ensures that the knowledge we acquire while discussing the feature does not slip through our fingers in the future, so that JIRA issues can also be the reference of future users that would like to, for example, add new related functionality, or future developers who are fixing a bug on the feature, or future testers who want to verify that the feature is not broken before a new version of ArchivesSpace is released, for example. So I would like to introduce the behavior scenarios as a template for capturing knowledge of a feature request. This is, of course, not our idea. It has been around as a software development practice since many years. A behavior scenario is a story describing how a user interacts with an ArchivesSpace system. It's a narration of a specific interaction scenario between ArchivesSpace users and the system. The story tries to be concrete in the sense that normally requirements can also be formed as abstract statements, but a behavior scenario is usually a concrete example of how people interact in a specific situation, in a specific context with ArchivesSpace. It is also, or it should also not be implementation specific. So there should not be low-level implementation details included in a behavior scenario, such as data structures, servers, databases, and or application architecture mentioned there. Also, no user interface details like buttons, specific forms, fields, etc. It's more about the user intentions and the responses of the system. So it is supposed to be, as they say, just enough and just in time software design, or lightweight examples that provide enough context to start developing the feature. Gherkin, which is also known as a given, when, then syntax, is a language for writing such behavior scenarios. Gherkin scenarios are meant to be short and sound like plain English. Each scenario has this structure of three parts, basically. One part that starts with sentences starting with a keyword given, then followed by sentences starting with the keyword when, and finally sentences starting with the keyword then. Given sentences describe some initial state or context where a user action described in sentences starting with when is referenced. So one or more when sentences describe user actions that trigger reactions or responses or desired outcomes from the system, which are in turn described in sentences starting with the keyword then. So as a bridge between users, developers, and testers, Gherkin is trying to be a plain text language with a simple structure that is intended to be easy enough to learn for non-programmers, while allowing the level of specificity that is required by developers to successfully develop a feature, and also required by testers to test that feature. Let's see an example to make this a bit more concrete. So here we see a scenario line that is expressed in the already used in our Jira feature requests template of as a specific user role, I want to perform an action so that I can fulfill a goal or get to a certain outcome. In this case, as a staff member, I want to log in so that I can access restricted functionality. Already, by reading this simple sentence, we get a lot of information. We can see the why of this feature. Why is this specification written? To protect restricted functionality from anonymous users. And we can also see who is the most important stakeholder in this feature. In this case, the staff members who care about protecting this functionality and having access to it only after being logged in. Then we see the steps that we were talking about before of this scenario. Let's start by the last part, which is the then step, where we see actually the outcome that we expect from the system. In this case, that the user is successfully logged in. In order to reach this outcome, there is some user actions that are happening, that are in reference to in this when step and the and starting sentence that follows it. So when the user browses the login form and the user submits their credential, then the user is successfully logged in. At the beginning of this scenario, we see the given step, actually two of them, the given followed by another end sentence, where a certain context is outlined. In this case, that the user has already created a staff account and the user is not logged in yet. So these scenario steps provide the context in these, the givens steps, the events that trigger the responses of the system, the user actions that are events that trigger responses from the system, and the outcomes that happen, basically that the user is successfully logged in. Note that this is not a list of imperative steps, but a short description of a specific reaction of the system to a user action in a specific context. This is what we call a behavior. When we say imperative, we basically mean that this is not a list of low-level steps on the user interface. There is no mentioning here of specific buttons or text fields, etc. But it is more a declarative description in the sense that it describes intentions of the user and responses of the system. Also, it is important to note that this is one scenario that describes a specific behavior. We will expand on this later. Because they are written in plain English, they are inclusive and understood by all the three groups that we were talking before. So behavior scenarios are equally understood by users who propose a feature, by developers who write the code to support the feature, and by testers who test whether the implementation of the feature works as expected. Let's take a deeper look in this Gherkin language and some more of the keywords that comprise it. So starting with the feature keyword, we can have a general description of the feature request that usually can include many such behavior, many concrete behavior scenarios. This feature description is preferably in the form that we already know. So as a persona or as a member of a specific user group, I want to perform an action on the system UI usually, so that an outcome is achieved, a result is fulfilled. In a group of or in a paragraph starting with a background, we can optionally include some more context or the background idea of the feature request. We can also have a sentence starting with a rule keyword that could be a general rule that then can be more specified in a group of specific scenarios, of behavior scenarios. And then in the lower level, we can have the scenario as we saw before. The title of the scenario is usually expressed as a summary of the behavior, again, as many times as in this template of as a group member, I want to perform something so that I achieve something. Each scenario can be comprised of three types of steps: the given steps giving some initial state, the when steps that are referring to user actions, and the then steps that describe the expected outcomes. After each of these given, when, and then steps, we can have one or more sentences starting either with and or but to give additional givens, additional whens, or additional thens, just to avoid this repeating these keywords and making the reading of this scenario even more tedious. Note that there is no or step in this template or in this Gherkin language. And that is because each scenario is a sequence of steps that is describing a specific behavior. So if an or step seems necessary to describe another path in the sequence of events of a scenario, then this is an indication of actually the need for yet another scenario to describe this alternative path. It is important to note also that these given when and then steps are ordered. They must appear in this order and they cannot repeat. This means that a given may not follow a when or a then, and a when may not follow a then. They have to appear in this given when then order. And this is because any single when then pair denotes an individual behavior, and each scenario covers one specific behavior. If more than one when then pairs seem necessary, then this probably means that separate scenarios should be written instead. So each scenario should describe a single behavior. Let's talk a little bit more about the step phrasing. So yeah, all the steps have to stay ordered, as we saw before. We need to include as much detail as possible, meaning that for each step, meaning that we should not leave out parts of the step for brevity. So although it sounds tedious to repeat nouns such as the user does this or the user does that on every when step, or the resource is changing this and or whatever other status. Nevertheless, repeating these nouns and making clear to what each step refers to avoids confusion, and it is good to keep doing. And writing all steps in third person is also a good idea. If first person and third person steps mix, scenarios can become confusing. We generally prefer to write steps as a subject predicate action phrase, which can use passive and active voice. But let's be sure to write our scenarios in a way that describes the intended action of the user and the expected result of the system. Using generally present tense for all step types is a good idea to ensure that each step refers to an action that happens during the scenario and not something that should have happened already or will happen at some future time, which can cause confusion. We spoke about this a bit before, that good steps are declarative in that they state user intentions and system responses and stay in this higher level of not describing specific low-level instructions directly referring to the UI, for example. These kind of low-level requirements can be much better outlined with a screen mockup, as we have seen in the previous session. And we have as a practice in our Jira feature requests generally already. This maybe sounds too much theory. Let's take a look at the real world example. I use this ANW504 ticket as an example. This is a feature that we have already implemented in our latest 3.5.0 release. And I would like to make the point that the process of this feature of discussing, implementing, and testing this feature could have been much smoother if some behavior scenarios like in this language that I have been talking about were included early on in the discussion. Let's take a look at the ticket. Let me see if I can bring it up here. Yes. So here we can see that the issue is super old. It was created in 2012, and it was finally moved to ready for implementation at some point in October of 2022, which is practically like 10 years later. So we would like to make the point that probably it would get faster prioritized if the requirements were more clear or became clearer sooner. Still, another point that I would like to show is that still until today, this issue description is almost empty. There is just a small sentence here that actually is wrong because the final agreed specification of this ticket does not refer to what this sentence defines, that it will impact what gets returned in search results, browse results, etc. Because actually this feature refers to something that is only viewable on the staff UI, on the edit and view or edit and show views for resources and the mark XML exports of the resources. So, and so my point is that if we imagine somebody who would need to test this feature because of a bug that appears some point in the future, or so that tester would have to go through this whole conversation and form again from the beginning some kind of mental model of what was the final agreed specification or the expected behavior of the system, which would probably be quite unambiguous. And we can see that at some point in the conversation, there was such an example of somebody who was testing this feature, and it was not so clear to them that actually there was no changes were expected on the public user interface. And not only that, but also one of our developers actually did implement a way to show a change in the public user interface because somehow it made sense. Although actually it was agreed that it shouldn't, there shouldn't be such a change on the public user interface because it would cause unnecessary confusion. This was so this code was actually reverted in our repository. I am talking about this and taking this issue as an example because there are many other such issues, and I am sure many of you have already some examples in your mind where the process of coming to an agreement about a specific feature involves, as expected, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different viewpoints, different understandings of the whole thing, and finally comes to a certain agreement, which is not so much document or not clearly documented in the Jira issue. And in the following slides, I would like to present some behavior scenarios that could contribute to clarifying this specific feature and smoothing the process of agreeing upon how the system should behave, of implementing this feature, and also the process of verifying that it was actually implemented correctly, the testing of the feature. Let me go back to... So let's talk a little bit more about this feature declaration or the slight change that I would propose to it. Basically, I would just add one more part, that part that is missing in the Jira title of this issue. And then the complete feature declaration would read as an archivist, I want to mark none or exactly one agent link of a resource or digital object or accession, etc., or as primary, so that the primary agent appears as a 100 filled-in mark XML exports. By just adding this part here, we already make a clear indication of where this should appear, and although not really making it explicit, we probably imply that it shouldn't appear anywhere else. Of course, this is not just clear by this description. That is why we need more requirements and more text in this. Another part that could be added would be a background group of sentences or paragraph that could read as such, so that the primary agent, the agent link that was labeled as primary, should for a specific resource, should appear as a 100 field in the mark XML exports of that resource. It should not be viewable anywhere in the public user interface, and on the staff user interface, it should only be viewable on the edit and show views of a resource. Then we could add some more specific scenarios. In this case, again, I would like to stress the fact that these scenarios are not abstract descriptions of the requirement, but more concrete and specific stories about user and system interactions in a specific context. So let's read this scenario. As a staff user or as an archivist, that could also be the case, I want to mark exactly one agent as a primary on a resource so that it appears as primary on the edit view of the staff user interface. So given the user opens the edit form of a resource on a staff user interface, and the resource has 3 agent links, 2 creators and 1 subject. In this step also, we have a very specific outline of the context. And the second agent link is already marked as primary. Now comes the user actions. So when the user marks the first agent as primary, then the system should react so that then the second agent does not appear as primary anymore, and the first agent appears marked as primary. So, to make a long story short, this refers to the fact that we can only have one specific agent link marked as primary, and doing this in a very concrete scenario, in a very concrete narration of a specific user interaction with an ArchivesSpace system. Note also that these given steps are not describing the complete steps of how to open the edit form of a resource in a detailed imperative step-by-step fashion. but it is describing only the conditions of this behavior, only including the relevant points that the resource has 3 agent links, that the second agent link is already marked as primary. Then this when describes the relevant action of the user, and then comes the expected response of the ArchivesSpace system. So this scenario is very concrete, describes a very specific case of a resource with 3 agents, etc., and not trying to be an abstract generic description of the feature. Let's take a look at another scenario that could also be included. So as a staff user, I want to see the primary agent of a resource on the show view of the resource on the staff user interface, so that it becomes clear that there is a primary agent defined for that resource. So given a staff user marks a specific agent link as primary on a resource, this is a very abstract description of what the precondition of this scenario is, but which actually just refers to the necessarily relevant details for this scenario. That, which basically is that a specific agent link is marked as primary for that resource. So given this precondition, when the user opens the show view for that resource on the staff user interface, then the system responds so that the agent link is marked as primary. That's it. That's a very simple usage scenario again. That nevertheless provides a lot of information of how this should appear on the show view of the staff user interface. And another third scenario that I would propose. So as an archivist, I want to see a 100 field for the primary agent in the mark XML export of a resource. So given the user opens the edit form of a resource on the staff user interface, and the resource has 3 agent links, in this example, 2 creators and 1 subject, and the second agent link is already marked as primary, when the user downloads a mark XML export of that resource, then there should be a 100 type field appearing in the mark XML export for that primary agent link. Notice that there is no effort to describe how the user downloads a mark XML export of that resource. All this could be part of a screen mockup that we talked about. And the focus is on the behavior, not so much on the UI or the implementation details. I have prepared another, this I would skip this for now because I see we don't have so much time, and I would love to get in a conversation phase of this session soon. I would like to mention that we have updated some of our wiki pages, the ones that are referring to how to request a new feature. And we have also added a wiki page describing these behavior scenarios and more or less this information that I have in this presentation for people who are interested to dive deeper. There is also some more, there's a book that I mentioned here and some links to articles that are relevant. Thank you very much for your attention. I know this is quite a lot of information. I would be happy to receive more questions, or please feel free to get in touch to us in ArchivesSpace@liasis.org.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Thimios. And congratulations on your first ArchivesSpace presentation at a forum. Hopefully there will be many more to come. This was really helpful. And I would like to say just point out that wiki documentation that Thimios highlighted. We have updated our instructions on how to request a new feature and how to report a bug, as well as creating that new page that explains these behavior scenarios in a little more depth. I think that it is wonderful, the work that Thimios has already put in, and I really recommend reviewing those before submitting feature requests so that they can be more successful, like he said. If you have any questions, please do drop them into the Q&A. We do have one question, Thimios, from Lauren. Should we create a ticket for each scenario, even if the scenarios are related to one another, like the primary agent example that you provided?
That's a very good question. Actually, I would imagine behavior scenarios as stories that could be included in the Jira issue of a specific feature request. So normally I would propose that we include multiple such user scenarios in a single Jira issue, in a single feature request. And this is actually, maybe I can present this, something that I have tried to do in this ticket here, where in the 504 ticket that I was talking about, I tried to I added some some user scenarios. How many? Three, like 5 of them within this issue. Normally, I would expect these user scenarios not to appear as a comment in the Jira issue, or better said, they could be first appearing as a comment in the Jira issue, but finally, it could be great if they would land in the description field of this of a ticket once people involved in the conversation have agreed on them. In this way, a future reviewer of this Jira issue could reference to those scenarios easily just by reading the description and not going through the whole conversation. I hope I have answered.
Yeah, Lauren says that makes sense to me to include the scenarios in the same feature request. Thanks. Katerina says, thanks for demystifying Jira requests. Any other questions for Thimios? I have a question that came to me directly. Does that mean it is for the dev pri to move scenarios into the description, or for the creator of the ticket to do so?
Wow, that's a very good question. I would love to see everybody feeling prone to describe their idea of how the system should behave in the context of a specific feature as a user scenario. And in the end, I would love I think it would be very helpful for all of us if everybody feel free to edit the description of the ticket once there is an agreement reached by the people involved. Now, the exact moment or the procedure for this kind of agreement, I'm not sure how this could be something that we should discuss. I mean, should it be a member of the DevPri team or any user who has access to our Jira system? I would love to have it as democratic as possible and as open as possible. But since I am not the one who really should take this kind of decision, I would keep this question and discuss it in a bigger circle.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a bigger question about how to come to decisions, though I think that having these behavior scenarios and these use cases in the ticket, it's so helpful because it helps make those decisions and make those decisions faster and make those decisions actionable. So if you have a scenario, please do put it in a ticket. Don't be shy. And then there's also larger questions around Jira, like permissions and things, but comment on those tickets for sure. And we can talk about this as a group later. Any other questions for Thimios? I'm speaking slowly. I know that we are at that time, so there may not be any more, but I'm speaking slowly in case anyone has a last minute thought. In the meantime, I am very excited to say I think Confluence is back up, so you can review the agenda for our next 2 sessions this afternoon and tomorrow if you'd like. If you haven't had a chance to register for either of those, please do feel free and we can get you approved for those. In the meantime, I will say thank you to Thimios. Thank you to all of our presenters for the first session of the virtual member forum. It has been great. Thank you everyone for sticking with us, even through some technical complications. And I look forward to seeing you all again in 2 hours. Thank you, everyone.